The office was chilled to exactly 64 degrees, smelling faintly of expensive incense and cold steel. Han Jun, the man who owned every shadow in this district, didn't look up from his ledger. He didn't need to. He simply flicked a gold Zippo, the flame dancing in the reflection of Sheila's calm, dark eyes. "Midnight, Sheila," Han Jun murmured, his voice a low, melodic threat. "You have until sunrise to be past the city limits. If the sun finds you within my reach, it will be the last thing you ever see. I don't give second chances to those who know too much." Sheila stood perfectly still. Most people would be trembling, pleading for their lives, or bargaining with the Gimpa syndicate. Instead, she watched the way the smoke curled toward the ceiling. She didn't ask why. She didn't explain that she was the architect who had built the very money laundering systems he was currently reviewing. She simply tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I understand," she said. It wasn't a plea, it was a statement of fact. Han Jun finally looked up, a cruel, handsome smirk playing on his lips. He mistook her lack of movement for paralysis, her silence for the shattering of her spirit. He thought he had finally broken the only person who knew where his skeletons were buried. As Sheila turned to leave, she didn't head for her apartment to pack. She dropped her high-end burner phone into the trash can, revealing she had been recording the entire meeting, not for blackmail, but for a voice recognition bypass she needed to trigger a blackout in the city's main power grid. The city smelled of rain, sesame oil, and industrial grease. To the tourists, it was a K-drama neon playground. To Han Jun, it was a kingdom. To Sheila, it was a biological organism with 1,000 tiny, hungry mouths. She walked through the Gangnam-side docks, past the ports where the shipping containers hissed with the weight of illicit cargo, and through the alleyways where the street enforcers stood like silent gargoyles. She wasn't a stranger here. She was the ghost who had kept the gears greased for a decade while Han Jun climbed to the top. She knew which shipping crates held medicine and which club owners were skimming off the top to pay for their gambling debts in Macau. The city ate its own, but Sheila knew how to cook the meal. Stopping at a rain-slicked public terminal, one of the few left in the district, she typed a code from memory. She didn't look back to see the black sedan trailing her 2 blocks behind. She knew Han Jun's men were there. She wanted them to watch her do absolutely nothing of consequence. "It's me," she whispered into the receiver once the connection secured. "The harvest is early. Tell the others the storm has moved inland. It's time to activate the contingency." The person on the other end of the line wasn't a criminal or a bodyguard. It was the city commissioner's private secretary, a woman Sheila had been quietly supporting for years by paying for her mother's medical bills. Back in his penthouse, Han Jun poured a glass of 30-year-old hibiki. He was a man defined by his lack of patience. In the world of the Korean underworld, hesitation was a death sentence. To Han Jun, time was a resource to be spent, never saved. He paced the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the grid of lights that represented his absolute authority. "Where is she?" he barked at his head of security, a hulking man named Miller. "Walking, boss," Miller replied, checking his tablet. "She's in the north end, near the old markets. No luggage, no car. She's just walking. We think she's in shock, or perhaps waiting for a train that isn't coming." Han Jun let out a short, sharp laugh. The sound was devoid of humor. "Shock? No, she's waiting for a miracle. Sheila thinks someone is coming to save her. She thinks the loyalty she built counts for something in this town." He took a slow sip, feeling the burn in his throat. "Let her walk. Let her feel every inch of the city she's losing. It'll make the exit more painful when she realizes nobody is coming." He didn't want her dead yet. He wanted her to feel the weight of his reach, to know that every street she stepped on belonged to the man who had discarded her. Han Jun noticed a silent notification on his private screen. His personal vault, which required his specific vocal pitch to open, had just logged a test access from an internal terminal he thought was decommissioned. He ordered surveillance, not execution. The net was tightening. Sheila could feel the static in the air. On every corner, civilians with tucked-in shirts and earpieces watched her pass. The main arteries of the city, the bridges over the Han River and the tunnels were now checkpoints manned by Han Jun's most loyal dogs. They weren't looking for drugs or guns. They were looking for a woman in a charcoal coat.
Sheila stepped into a crowded subway station, the midnight rush of the late shift workers providing a temporary veil. She moved with a rhythmic grace, never rushing, never looking over her shoulder. She knew Han Jun had tapped her old SIM card, but she wasn't using it. She was using the city's infrastructure itself, tapping into the transit Wi-Fi with a ghost protocol. She slipped into a maintenance corridor, using a key she had duplicated 3 years ago, just in case. The damp air of the tunnels smelled of wet stone and old secrets. Above her, the city roared, unaware that its pulse was being redirected. She emerged in the basement of a nondescript brownstone. A door opened before she could even knock. A man in a tailored suit stood there, his face shadowed by the dim streetlights outside. "You're late," he said, his voice tense. "The shadows were longer than expected," Sheila replied. The man opening the door was the lead investigator for the Organized Crime Task Force, the very man Han Jun had been bribing for a decade to look the other way. Inside the brownstone, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and expensive tobacco. The investigator, Detective Marcus Thorne, didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man who hadn't slept since the late 90s. "I shouldn't be doing this," Thorne said, leaning against a mahogany desk. "If Han Jun finds out I'm hosting you, my pension is the least of my worries. I'll be buried in the foundation of his new luxury hotel before the sun comes up." Sheila didn't blink. "7 years ago, your daughter was taken by the rival Busan crew. Han Jun wanted to let them keep her to avoid a turf war. I was the one who leaked their location to you. I was the one who disabled their security cameras so you could get her out." Thorne went quiet. The memory of his terrified daughter coming home was the only thing that kept him human in a city this corrupt. He had spent years pretending he didn't know who his guardian angel was. Tonight, the debt was called due. He handed her a heavy leather case. Inside were 3 things: a master key to the city's fiber optic hubs, a list of Han Jun's unrecorded offshore accounts, and a heavy-duty encrypted radio. Thorne didn't just give her the equipment, he handed her his backup badge, telling her that for the next 6 hours he was off the grid, and he would act as her legal shield if the police intercepted her. Sheila stood on the rooftop of a parking garage, overlooking the glowing neon spine of the Gangnam district. The wind whipped her hair, but she didn't feel the chill. She looked at her watch, 3:15 a.m. According to Han Jun's ultimatum, she had less than 3 hours to disappear forever. But the rhythm of the city had changed. The frantic pacing of the Gumpaw patrol cars had slowed to a crawl. The sirens that usually punctuated the night were replaced by an eerie, heavy stillness. She realized then that she didn't need the sunrise to grant her safety. The deadline was no longer her cage, it was his. She pulled a tablet from her bag, the heart of the city's digital nervous system. With a few keystrokes, she bypassed the final encryption layer of the Municipal Transit Authority. She wasn't looking for a train out. She was ensuring that nothing and no one could leave the downtown district without her say-so. The hunter was now the one being circled.
She looked toward the dark silhouette of Han-jun's penthouse. "The clock didn't start for me, Han-jun," she whispered to the wind. "It started for you." Sheila didn't just lock the city down, she remotely activated the public safety emergency sirens in Han-jun's neighborhood, creating a chaotic vacuum that forced the last of the police presence away from his front door. In the war room, the silence was broken by a single sharp ping. Every screen in Han-jun's office, the monitors, the televisions, even his gold-plated private cell phone flickered to life. A single video feed appeared. It wasn't a grainy hostage video or a manifesto. It was a live feed of the Seoul harbor, where the sunrise was just beginning to touch the horizon in a faint, bruised purple. Then, the text began to crawl across the screens in a simple, elegant Korean font. "I'm not leaving." Han-jun stared at the words, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He felt the phantom weight of his empire slipping through his fingers. He had given her an out. He had offered her life in exchange for her absence. To him, her refusal wasn't just defiance, it was an act of war against his very existence. "Find her," Han-jun whispered, his voice trembling with fury. "I don't care about the shadows anymore. I don't care about the witnesses. Burn the district if you have to. Bring me her head before the sun is fully up." The message wasn't just sent to Han-jun. It was broadcast to every digital billboard in the city center, announcing her presence to the entire underworld as a beacon of the new regime. Han-jun's full retaliation was supposed to be a tidal wave of fire and steel. He sent out the coded signal for his shadow cells, the violent mercenaries he kept for the end of the world. But the signal didn't bounce. It hit a wall. As his men scrambled to their armored SUVs, the garage doors of the warehouse refused to open. The fuel pumps at his private gas station stopped working. Even the elevators in his own building froze between floors, trapping his elite security teams in steel boxes. The machine was stuttering. The massive, complex web of logistics that Han-jun used to control the city, the bribes, the transport, the communications, was being systematically dismantled. It was like watching a grand piano being deconstructed while someone was still trying to play a concerto. "Sir, the GPS is routing the men into dead ends," Miller shouted, his voice cracking. "The traffic lights are all red. The bridges are being raised. We're trapped in our own sectors." Han-jun kicked over his mahogany desk, the heavy wood splintering. He was a king with no way to reach his battlefield. The system failure wasn't a glitch. Sheila had rerouted the city's automated waste management fleet to block every major exit of Han-jun's properties, burying his fleet in tons of garbage. Pressure doesn't just break things, it reveals the cracks that were already there. Inside Han-jun's inner sanctum, the remaining lieutenants were no longer looking at the screens, they were looking at each other. "He's lost it," whispered Guan, the man in charge of the city's ports. "He's chasing a ghost while our bank accounts are being drained. I've got family to think about. I'm not dying for a man who can't even open his own garage door." The loyalty that Han-jun had bought with fear was evaporating. Without the threat of his violence being backed by his resources, he was just an old man in an expensive suit. Suddenly, Guan stood up. He didn't say a word to Han-jun. He simply unclipped his holster, laid his gun on the table, and walked toward the exit. "Where do you think you're going?" Han-jun hissed, pulling a small derringer from his vest. Guan didn't even turn around. "To find her. I'd rather work for the woman who took the city in a night than the man who lost it in an hour. Your sun is setting, June." Guan wasn't just leaving. He had already been in contact with Sheila for months, acting as her inside man in the city in exchange for a seat at the new table. The first rays of the sun finally crested the horizon, painting the skyscrapers in hues of gold and rose.
This was the moment Han Jun promised would be Sheila's end. He stood on his balcony, looking out at the waking city, expecting to see the smoke of her demise. Instead, the city looked peaceful. The morning commuters began to trickle onto the streets. The buses ran on time. The shops opened their doors. To the average citizen, it was just another Tuesday in the capital. But Han Jun knew better. He checked his private line. No one answered. He checked the cameras at the border. There was no sign of her charcoal coat. She was still here. She was everywhere. The city breathed, but it was breathing her air now. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just failed to exile her. He had successfully exiled himself. He was the one trapped in a fortress that no longer commanded the streets below. The sun had risen, and he was the only one left in the dark. As the sun hit Han Jun's face, he realized his fortress was missing something, the silent hum of the building's air filtration. He was breathing in a faint, sweet scent, the same jasmine perfume Sheila always wore. The silence in the penthouse was no longer respectful. It was suffocating. Han Jun couldn't stand it. For 20 years he had ruled from the clouds, but a god who cannot reach his disciples is just a prisoner in a high-rise. "Get the car," Han Jun commanded. "The elevators are still dead, sir," Miller whispered, "and the stairs, the security doors have magnetically locked from the outside." Han Jun didn't hesitate. He pulled an emergency axe from the wall and shattered the glass of the service panel. He was a man of the old world. He still believed that enough force could solve any problem. He forced the manual release, the heavy steel groaning as it gave way. He didn't take an army. He didn't take his lieutenants. He took a single suppressed pistol and began the long descent. He wanted to find Sheila and look into her eyes before he ended her. He walked out of his lobby and into the cool morning air, expecting an ambush. The street was empty. No black SUVs, no gunmen, just a single black taxi waiting at the curb with its door ajar. The cab's meter was already running, and the destination preset on the dashboard was the very first warehouse Han Jun had used to store his first shipment of illegal goods. The warehouse was a shell of rusted iron and broken glass in the old industrial district. Han Jun stepped out of the cab, his polished shoes crunching on debris. He kept his hand on the weapon in his pocket, his eyes darting to the rafters. He expected a sniper. He expected a dozen men to swarm from the shadows. But there was nothing. No guns, no shouting, just the distant sound of a foghorn.
He stepped inside. In the center of the room sat 2 folding chairs and a small wooden table. On the table sat a single, steaming cup of barley tea and a thick file folder. Han Jun realized then that the trap wasn't physical. There were no tripwires. The isolation was the weapon. In his fortress, he had the illusion of control. Out here, in the bones of the neighborhood he had forgotten, he was just a man. He realized his phone had no signal, not because of a jammer, but because Sheila had removed his identity from the network entirely. When Han Jun tried to pull his gun, he found the holster empty. The cab driver, a pickpocket Sheila had once saved from the Goompa, had lifted it during the ride. Sheila stepped out from behind a rusted iron pillar. She wasn't wearing tactical gear. She wore the same charcoal coat from the night before, looking as though she'd spent the evening at a quiet dinner rather than dismantling an empire. "You're late, June," she said, her voice calm. "The sun is quite high." Han Jun lunged at her, his hands clawing for her throat, but his legs gave out. He collapsed into the folding chair, the weight of the night finally crushing him. "You think this is a victory?" he wheezed. "You've destroyed the order. There will be blood in the streets." "No," Sheila replied, sitting opposite him. She pushed the tea toward him. "The blood was already there. You just hid it under your ledgers. I didn't destroy the order, I simply changed the management. She didn't gloat. She spoke to him like a consultant explaining a necessary merger. She detailed exactly how she had moved his assets into a trust that favored the city's infrastructure over his personal vanity. Sheila revealed she wasn't working alone. She had spent the night being coached by Han Jun's own father, the man Han Jun thought he had sent into permanent retirement in the countryside. Sheila opened the file folder. Inside were the new deeds to every major property Han Jun owned. They weren't in her name. They were in a shell corporation owned by a collective of the city's small business owners and the very lieutenants who had abandoned him. You see, Jun, you ruled through fear because you thought people were selfish. But people aren't just selfish, they're exhausted. They didn't want your war. They wanted a life that didn't require looking over their shoulder. She showed him a live feed on her tablet. The city's ports were moving again. The protection money usually collected was being diverted into a public works fund. The structure was the same. The money still flowed, but the destination had shifted. Your name is still on the building. You'll keep your penthouse. You'll keep your whiskey. But you will never make a decision again. You are the figurehead of a ghost ship. He was a king in a museum, allowed to keep his crown as long as he never tried to use it. The one choice she gave him wasn't life or death, but a pen. He could sign the papers and live in luxury as a prisoner, or refuse and have his entire history of crimes leaked to the International Criminal Court. He has one choice. Han Jun looked at the pen. For a man who had signed death warrants with gold-plated nibs, it was the ultimate insult. He looked at Sheila, looking for a flicker of hesitation. He found only the steady, cold gaze of a woman who had already won. He signed. The scratch of the pen on the paper was the only sound in the warehouse. There was no fanfare, no dramatic arrest. In the eyes of the world, Han Jun was still the most powerful man in the city, but as he handed the folder back to Sheila, he felt the last of his vitality leave him. Sheila stood up and tucked the folder under her arm. The car is waiting to take you home, Jun. Enjoy the view. It's a beautiful city when you're not trying to choke the life out of it. She walked out into the sunlight, leaving him alone in the dust. The city woke up to a new day, unaware that its soul had been traded in a rusted warehouse. As Han Jun left the warehouse, he saw a young girl playing on the sidewalk. She handed him a small paper crane, a silent signal from the neighborhood that they knew he was no longer the tiger he once was. The transition was surgical. In the weeks that followed, the city's pulse stabilized into a rhythm it hadn't known in decades. The frantic, jagged edges of Han Jun's reign, the midnight shootings, the high-speed chases, simply evaporated. Crime didn't stop, but it became a utility. It was quiet and efficient. The dock workers found their union dues were actually being used for medical insurance. The street-level dealers were moved into legitimate delivery logistics. The chaos was replaced by a cold, mathematical peace. Sheila sat in a small, windowless office beneath the city's central library. She didn't need a penthouse to rule. She needed the data. She watched the spreadsheets move. She watched the crime statistics drop as the tax on the city was redirected into its own marrow.
But in the high society galas and the smoky back rooms of the remaining bars, a question began to hum. If Han Jun was still in his tower, but no longer issuing orders, who was holding the leash? The vacuum of visible power was creating a new kind of legend. The new order wasn't just managing crime. Sheila had quietly begun lobbying for a law that would make the city's digital infrastructure privately owned by her own public trust. Whispers are the currency of the disenfranchised. In the shadows of the markets, the story began to take on the quality of a legend. They spoke of the shadow architect, a woman who had walked through Hanjun's fire and come out without the smell of smoke on her clothes. The details grew with every telling. Some said she had an army of ghosts. Others said she had hacked the very brains of the syndicate lieutenants. The truth, that she was simply a woman who understood the city better than the men who tried to own it, was far less exciting than the myth. Sheila leaned into the anonymity. She stopped wearing the charcoal coat. She changed her hair, her gait, her coffee shop. She became a face in the crowd. She realized that to rule a city like this, one must either be a god or a ghost. She chose to be the latter. The more people looked for her, the less they saw. She dismantled her physical headquarters every 48 hours, moving through the city's veins like a white blood cell. Sheila didn't just disappear, she started planting false leads that pointed to a fictional council of 5 elders, ensuring that any future rivals would waste years hunting enemies that didn't exist. Hanjun sat in his leather armchair, staring at the panoramic view of the skyline. He had all the whiskey he could drink and all the silk he could wear. He was alive, but he was a ghost in his own life. Every morning, a folder was placed on his desk. It contained reports of his decisions, orders he never gave, alliances he never forged, and profits he never saw. He was forced to sign them. If he refused, his access to the world was cut. If he yelled, the staff, all Sheila's people, simply smiled and offered him a sedative. He watched through his telescope as the city thrived. He saw the parks being rebuilt with his money. He saw the crime rates plummet in neighborhoods he used to burn. It was a torture designed specifically for a man like him, to see the world become a better place because your power was taken away. Mercy, he realized, was far more sadistic than a bullet. A bullet ended the story. This was a never-ending epilogue where he was the villain who had been rendered irrelevant. Hanjun discovered that his private black book of secrets had been published as an anonymous web novel, turning his life's work into a cheap daily thrill for the public to mock. He understands mercy can be crueler than death. For the first time in a generation, the city felt light. The heavy, oppressive thumb of the Gyumpa had been lifted, and in the vacuum, something unexpected happened. The city started to breathe on its own. Small businesses thrived because the protection money was gone. Money flowed, but it flowed cleanly. The underground economy didn't disappear, it was simply absorbed into the municipal budget through a series of complex, untraceable donations. Detective Thorne sat at his desk and looked at a map with no red zones. He knew exactly what had happened, but as he watched the city transform, even he began to wonder about the long-term cost. "She's a monarch without a throne," his deputy remarked one evening as they looked over the peaceful river. "Do you think she'll ever come out of the shadows? Do you think she'll ever rule openly?" Thorne shook his head. "She doesn't need to. You only show your hand when you're losing, and right now, she owns the deck." Thorne realized that his own daughter's college tuition was being paid by the same council scholarship Sheila had created. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled wasn't convincing the world he didn't exist, it was convincing the world that he was the only one who could keep things in order. The subway stations, the libraries, and the quiet parks were all filled with people engaged in their daily activities without fear. Sheila sits on a park bench, feeding the birds. She looks like anyone else. She looks like no one at all. She didn't take the city with an army. She didn't take it with fear. She took it by being the person who remembered the names of the people Hanjun forgot. She took it by understanding that a city isn't made of glass and steel, but of debts, secrets, and the need for order. She never had to rule openly because the city had already chosen her. It chose the hand that fed it over the hand that choked it. As the sun sets, Casting long, peaceful shadows over the metropolis, Sheila closes her book and walks away. She doesn't rule the city. She is the city.